The wind howled outside, scratching at the windows like a hand begging to be let in. I could hear it, the relentless tapping, but it wasn't enough to pull me away from the thick stack of overdue bills sitting in front of me. Each envelope felt like a weight pressing down harder than the last. I hadn't been able to bring myself to open them all, but I knew they'd be the same. Notices, threats, reminders. I was stuck. 5 years had passed since Karen died, but the grief still wrapped itself around me like a shroud, suffocating and constant. I couldn't shake the feeling of her absence. The silence in the apartment was unbearable. It was her silence, her empty chair, the smell of her perfume that still lingered in the corners of our room, and the remnants of her presence I couldn't bear to part with. I still hadn't touched most of her things, afraid to let go of the memory, afraid that if I did, she'd slip away entirely. I hadn't been looking for a job, but when the ad for night watchman at First Hope Apothecary flashed across my computer screen, I felt a strange pull. The description was simple. Minimal duties, $20 an hour, peace and solitude, just what I needed. I told myself it was a sign, a way to get out of my rut, to find some kind of escape from the never-ending reminder of what I had lost. I could feel the weight of it, the nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me to just stay home to hold on to what little I had left, but the desperation was too strong. The moment I stepped outside, the world seemed to press in on me. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows down the cobblestone path. I kept my head low, trying to ignore the unease that clawed at the back of my neck, the sense that something wasn't right. The building came into view, a crumbling relic of a time long past. First Hope Apothecary was scrawled in peeling gold letters above the door, barely visible in the dimming light. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different, thick, weighted with something I couldn't place. The shelves were stacked high with jars filled with odd powders, herbs, and liquids that looked too old to be useful. The smell hit me next, a sharp, medicinal scent mixed with something earthy, like decay. Carl was standing behind the counter, his eyes darting around nervously. He didn't greet me with a smile. Instead, his hands trembled as he handed me a set of keys, the metal cold in my palm. "Lock the door at 11:57 sharp," he said, his voice tight, "and stay out of the back room. Just trust me." The unease settled deeper in my stomach, but I took the keys and nodded. I didn't know it yet, but this was where it all began. The point of no return. The first night was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of stillness that makes your ears ring. The wind howled outside, but inside the pharmacy, there was nothing. No hum of the fridge, no soft shuffle of a mouse in the walls, just the sound of my breath, steady but nervous. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its second hand sweeping in perfect circles, but it felt like time was dragging, stretching out each second longer than the last. I stood behind the counter, glancing at the front door. The dim light from the street filtered through the fog glass, casting faint shadows across the floor. Carl's rule kept repeating in my mind, an endless loop of warnings. Lock the door at 11:57. Stay out of the back room. It all seemed like overkill at first, just some paranoid nonsense, right? But the longer I stood there, alone, in the dim pharmacy, the heavier the weight of the rules became. They weren't just rules anymore. They felt like expectations, like they were meant to be. Followed. The sudden jingle of the doorbell startled me, making me jump. The wind outside had shifted, blowing harder against the building. I swore I saw the door move, but it didn't open. I laughed at myself, trying to shake off the nerves. Nothing to be afraid of. Just a pharmacy after all, just a building with shelves full of old jars and medicines. I started walking around the store to keep my mind busy, checking the aisles, running. My fingers over dusty shelves. Bottles and jars were stacked high, filled with powders and liquids that looked ancient. The labels were barely legible, the ink faded, like they'd been sitting there for centuries, waiting for someone to discover them. As I moved through the aisles, I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding, like I had walked into a place that didn't belong to this world anymore. The smell made it worse. The air was thick with herbs, but there was something underneath, something metallic, something wrong. I couldn't tell if it was the scent of age or decay, but it made my stomach churn. The shadows, too, seemed too dark. They were pulling into the corners of the room, stretching themselves like they were alive. They weren't supposed to be that way. I checked the clock again. 11:45 p.m. Be locked, but each second felt like an eternity. My eyes darted around the room, each shadow now feeling more oppressive than the last. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves. It wasn't until I opened the back room door that something inside me shifted. The air in there hit me like a slap, cold, sterile, as though I had stepped into a freezer. I hadn't expected such a dramatic change. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the temperature dropped instantly. The room was lined with metal cabinets that reflected the fluorescent light above. They stood like silent sentinels, cold and lifeless. But there was something about the room that didn't sit right with me, something that didn't belong. The smell, for one, was overpowering. It was antiseptic, yes, but underneath it was something else, a rotten sweetness, like something that had long since passed its expiration date. I wasn't sure what I was doing back there, maybe just looking for something to pass the time, or maybe I was just curious. I scanned the shelves for the first aid kit, one of the things Carl had mentioned, and pulled it down. It was dusty, more than I had expected. The metal box groaned as I opened it, the hinges protesting, a sound like something old waking from a long sleep. Inside, instead of the usual bandages and antiseptic wipes, I found something else, old. Strips of gauze, wrapped around something. My fingers shook as I pulled the first strip free, revealing writing. It wasn't instructions or medical notes. The handwriting was frantic, jagged. It looked like it had been written in a hurry, almost like someone had been desperate to get the words out before time ran out. Rules to survive the night, it said. My pulse quickened. I could feel the words pounding my chest as I read them, each line heavier than the last. The handwriting was wild, like whoever wrote it knew something terrible was coming. I sat down at the counter, my hands trembling as I slowly unfolded the first piece of gauze. The moment it unrolled, the faded ink caught my eye. It was deep brown almost, black in places, and in spots where the writer had hurried, the ink was smeared, like they had been shaking as they wrote. The script was jagged, each letter formed under duress, a frantic scrawl that seemed to pulse with urgency. I couldn't look away. Rules to survive the night, the first line read, and my heart skipped a beat. My throat tightened. I tried to convince myself it was just some kind of sick joke, a prank left behind by a former employee who had a twisted sense of humor. But as I read on, that thought became harder to hold on to. The rules felt too real. Number 1. Always lock the front door exactly at 11:57 p.m. and never unlock it until sunrise. Number 2. If you hear knocking from the cabinets, do not open them under any circumstances. Number 3. Leave an unopened bottle of rubbing alcohol on the back counter before midnight. Number 4. Never touch the old mortar and pestle in the display case. Number 5. If the lights flicker twice in a row, stand completely still until they stabilize. Number 6. Do not answer the landline phone if it rings after 1:30 a.m. Number 7. Always clean the glass medicine display before leaving, but never touch them. Jars with red labels. Each rule felt more unnerving than the last, a wave of unease crashing over me. Mine tried to dismiss it, to tell me it was just the ramblings of someone who'd been working in a place far too strange for too long. But something about the frantic scribbling made me feel like these rules weren't just words on paper. They were a lifeline, a desperate plea for survival. Whoever had written them needed someone to take them seriously. They needed someone to live through the night. I swallowed hard, glancing at the clock on the wall. The second hand was ticking away, each sweep of its hand making my heartbeat louder in my ears. The time was creeping toward 11:57, and suddenly I felt that familiar tension again. Just lock the door, I told myself. It's just a routine. Just follow the rules. But my fingers were slick with sweat as I clutched the brass key. My thoughts kept returning to the last rule, the one that had unsettled me the most. Never touch the jar with red labels.
Why? Why was it so specific? I had seen the jars earlier. They're bright.
Red labels standing out against the dull backdrop of the dusty shelves. It felt like the entire room had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. A faint sound broke my concentration. It was coming from the back room, a soft scratching noise like someone was tapping at the metal cabinets. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, too alive. It didn't feel like a rat or a mouse. It felt like something more, something waiting. I told myself it was nothing, the wind, a draft, something mundane, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor as I tried to convince myself that this was just a job, a simple job. Focus, I thought. Just lock the door. Stay out of the back room. But the longer I sat there, the harder it became to ignore the sound. My heartbeat quickened, each thud in my chest matching scratching like some unholy rhythm, pulling me toward the back room. No, I told myself again. Don't go near the back room. Don't think about it. I glanced back at the clock. 11:56 p.m., another minute, and I'd have to lock the door. The pressure of it, the simple task of turning the key, should felt easy, but it didn't. The seconds stretched longer, as if the hands of the clock were mocking me. The scratching continued, a faint, relentless sound. I could hear it now more clearly, almost like nails dragging slowly against metal, deliberate and steady. My stomach twisted. My fingers tightened on the counter, trying to steady myself, but my mind was spiraling. I glanced back at the shelves again. The red-labeled jars, the words from the rules, echoed in my mind, louder now. Never touch the jars with the red labels. About those jars was different, but I couldn't let my mind linger on that. I had a job to do. Just lock the door. It's just a job. I gripped the keys harder. 11:57 was almost here. The clock ticked louder, until it drowned out everything else. The seconds dragged, hanging heavy in the air as I stared at the clock. 11:56 p.m. The moment the second hand ticked forward, the noise began. It started so faintly that I almost didn't hear it. A subtle drag across the floor, soft but unmistakable. My body went still. I was already holding my breath, waiting for something, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. A faint scraping, almost like someone was dragging a piece of metal against the floor, or scratching the walls with something sharp. It sent a jolt through my spine. On my arms stood on end, every muscle in my body locking into place as I stood frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard I thought the wood might crack beneath my palms. The sound came again, louder this time, definite tapping, like a knock, from one of the cabinets. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a pipe. Maybe the building was just settling. But then the sound echoed again, this time from another corner of the room. And then another. It wasn't just one. It was coming from everywhere. Each knock rang through the empty pharmacy, bouncing off the shelves, reverberating through my skull. My heart started to pound harder, a drumbeat I couldn't ignore. The air felt thick now, each breath coming short and shallow. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped the counter even tighter. Don't open the cabinets. The rule echoed in my mind, louder than the knocks. Do not open the cabinets. I didn't want to move, but my legs were shaking. I reached under the counter, my fingers fumbling as I grabbed the flashlight. My breath caught in my throat as I twisted the light on, the beam sputtering to life, flickering with a weak, wavering glow. The shadows around me seemed to pulse in time with the knocking, stretching unnaturally long and sharp. I could feel the darkness pulling in, closing in around me like it had become something alive. The tapping grew louder, insistent now, each knock ringing through the room like a warning. The sound vibrated in my bones, in my teeth, as if whatever was behind the cabinets was desperate to get out. I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It wasn't just the back room. The whole store seemed to be alive with it, walls shaking, air thickening with something unnatural. I backed away from the counter, my flashlight beam shaking, casting strange, twisted shadows that made my heart race faster. My feet felt heavy, like I was wading through thick fog, each step slow and measured. I knew I needed to lock the door. I had to lock it. But the thought of turning my back to the noise, of walking away from it, felt like a betrayal, like whatever was trying to get out would make its move the second I wasn't. Looking. I glanced again toward the back room, where the door still stood closed. The shadows around it weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving, shifting, sliding across the walls like they were alive. They didn't belong. They were reaching for something, for me, for something I couldn't see. I couldn't stop myself from taking another step back at the knock, the tapping, the relentless sound. It wasn't just coming from the cabinets anymore. It was coming from inside my head too, echoing in my skull, filling the air. I didn't know what was real anymore. I forced myself to move. I turned my back on the noise, on the moving shadows, and stumbled toward the front door, my breath shallow and ragged. I had to lock it. Lock it, I thought. Just do your job. I reached for the brass key, the cold metal shocking against my palm. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. 11:57 p.m. It was time. My hands shook as I twisted the key into the lock, the cold bite of the metal digging into my skin. The soft click of the door locking sounded far too loud, echoing through the empty pharmacy. I turned to face the darkness again, the room still filled with the sound of the knocking, and wondered, would it ever stop? Would it ever be over? I stood there, the key still cold in my hand, staring at the locked door. My heartbeat was the only sound that filled the silence. The knockings in the back room, now strangely still. The clock ticked, its second hand slicing through the air, but every sound around me felt amplified in the emptiness. Then I heard it. At first, it was a whisper, a faint, distant sound, almost too quiet to be real. My breath caught in my throat, straining to make sense of it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a creak in the building. It was a cry, a child's cry. But it wasn't like any cry I had ever heard. There was no desperation in it, no immediate need. It was hollow, distant, like a voice calling from deep underground. The sound seemed to drift in from the walls, echoing through the pharmacy in a way that didn't make sense. It was as if it was coming from the very foundation of the building, coming from somewhere it shouldn't have been. My feet stayed rooted to the floor as the cry grew louder, bouncing off the shelves, reverberating through the empty aisles. The walls seemed to breathe with it, the sound, distorting in waves, bending and stretching the air around me. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It felt as if the entire building had become a hollow shell, amplifying the sound and sending it spiraling back into my skull. I wasn't sure whether I should go check or just ignore it, but the sound was pulling me in. Something about it felt wrong, so wrong that every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to get out, to do anything except stay in the room with it, but I couldn't. The cry wasn't just in my ears. It was inside my chest, vibrating through my ribs, a cold pressure building behind my eyes. I reached out, my hand trembling as I steadied myself on the counter. The cry rose, echoing through the space, and then fell again, softer this time, like a muffled whimper. At the edge of the room, it was almost as if it was getting closer. I turned my head slowly toward the back room, and in that instant the cry stopped. The silence that followed was thick, more oppressive than anything I had felt all night. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air felt like it was pressing down on me.
Suffocating.
Then, the phone rang. The shrill mechanical sound sliced through the quiet like a blade. I woke to the sound of my name being whispered, soft but clear, right next to my ear. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, too scared to move. It was my voice, but I hadn't said anything. I hadn't even been asleep for long. I turned slowly, the breath caught in my throat, expecting nothing, expecting it to be some trick of my mind. But there, standing by the foot of my bed, was a shadow. It was tall, taller than any person, and it wasn't moving. It was just... I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move as the shadow leaned forward. Its face was a dark blur, just out of reach of the faint moonlight coming through the window. But I felt it, its eyes, cold and unblinking, locked on mine. Then I heard it again, my name. But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, clearer, and I knew with terrifying certainty it was me calling me. I shot out of bed, my legs shaky beneath me, and backed into the corner, desperate to get away. But the shadow didn't move. It just stayed there, silent and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. And I knew then I was no longer alone. Something had been waiting for me, something that wasn't finished. The wind howled against the old house, rattling the windows as I lay in bed, my body trembling beneath the weight of the cold sheets. It was just another night on the island, quiet, empty, and far too still. I had gotten used to the eerie quiet, the way the world felt like it had stopped moving, but tonight something felt different. Something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just the storm. The wind always made strange noises when it blew that hard, especially at night. But then I heard it, a soft scraping sound from above, the attic. It had always been creepy up there, but I'd never heard anything like this before. The noise came again, dragging against the wooden beams. Heart racing, my breath shallow. It sounded like something, or someone, was up there, moving around. I forced myself to stand, my feet heavy on the cold floor, and tiptoed into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle at the top of the stairs. My eyes scanned the shadows, every creak in the floorboard beneath me, sending a jolt of anxiety through my chest. The attic door was at the end of the hall, but no one was ever up there. My father hadn't been up there in years, and I'd always avoided it when I could. The scraping noise continued, louder now, followed by a faint thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze. I hadn't heard the door to the attic open. I hadn't seen anyone go up. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? The old house had its share of rats, but this felt wrong. Too deliberate, too rhythmic. I glanced at the door to the front porch. The rusty bell hanging above it suddenly rang. Just once. I froze again, staring at the door. No one was there. I hadn't even heard footsteps. The wind didn't blow that way, not strong enough to move it. My pulse quickened, my hands clammy as I slowly crept down the hall to the attic door. The scraping stopped suddenly, and in the dead silence that followed, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic thud, like something was breathing. A slow, heavy inhalation that rattled the walls. I reached the door, my hand trembling on the handle. It was locked. I backed away, feeling a sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. The air felt heavier, colder. Like the house itself was holding its breath. I looked back at the stairs. The house felt too empty now, as if something had settled into the walls, waiting. The next morning I tried to shake it off. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a stray animal, something I didn't hear right. But that night, the same noise came again, and this time it wasn't just scraping. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps pacing the attic floor as if someone was walking back and forth, waiting for something. I thought I was losing my mind. The next few days blurred into one another as I tried to go about my life, pretending that the noises weren't happening. But every time the wind picked up or the house creaked, I found myself tense, listening, waiting. I couldn't stop thinking about the attic. My father noticed my distraction. He'd been sick for some time, and his memory was starting to fail. One evening after dinner, he sat by the fire in the living room, staring into the flames. I hesitated before I spoke, unsure how to bring it up, but I needed to know. "Dad," I began quietly, "have you ever heard anything strange in the house? Like footsteps in the attic? Or, I don't know, things moving when no one's around?" He didn't answer right away, his cloudy eyes flickering over to the corner of the room as if searching for something. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, almost detached. "Strange things happen here, Alex," he said slowly. "People who come here, they don't always leave. Some of them, they get lost, they vanish, they're never seen again." I stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about? Lost to the sea?" He nodded, but his gaze never wavered from the fire. "The sea's got a hold on this island. It's like it's hungry, waiting for the next soul. The island's old, Alex, older than us. It's seen things, terrible things. People come here looking for something, answers, peace, maybe, but they end up listening to the wrong voices." I was taken aback. "What voices? What are you trying to say?" He didn't answer. His hands trembled as he folded them in his lap. His eyes were still, fixed on the flames, but I saw the fear there, buried deep beneath the years. Fear he wasn't willing to confront. "Don't go into the attic," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for me to hear. "Don't go looking for answers you can't handle." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The fear in his voice was real, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. My father knew something, and he wasn't telling me. That night, I tried to ignore the unease gnawing at my stomach, but when the wind picked up again, I heard it, scraping. This time it was louder, sharper. Something was moving in the attic, and it was waiting for me to find it. The following night was worse. The storm raged outside, slamming against the house. With a deafening roar, the shutters banged against the walls and the windows rattled in their frames. The air felt thick, the house groaning under the weight of the wind. I tried to sleep, but the noise kept me awake. It started with whispers, low, muffled voices. At first I thought it was the storm, the wind, slipping through cracks in the house. But then the voices grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just whispers, they were conversations, disjointed fragments of words, as if two people were talking just outside my door. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices sounded familiar, like they were speaking in my voice. I pulled the blankets tight around me and dared not move. The voices grew louder, closer. I could hear them clearly now, and I recognized the words. "Alex." Outside. The voice wasn't mine, but it was too close. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway just beyond the door. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my pulse racing. The house was so still now. Too still. The wind had died down. The voices had stopped. I forced myself to get up, my legs weak, the air thick with dread. The house was silent. But then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing just out of the reach of the dim light, was a figure, a shadow. It was tall, standing perfectly still. I could just make out its shape, but the closer I looked, the more the shadow seemed to twist and shift. I called out to it, my voice trembling. "Dad?" No response. I took one step forward, then another. My breath was shallow, my throat dry. When I got closer, the figure didn't move, didn't react. I reached out to touch it. My fingers brushed. The air and the shadow vanished, leaving behind an icy chill that made my skin crawl. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut. The whispers began again. But this time, they weren't just in the hallway. They were in my head, Alex. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing to block them out. The island had claimed me. The voices were its gift, and now they had come for me. The following days bled into one another. I couldn't tell if the house was getting worse, or if I was just becoming more attuned to the darkness around me. The whispers never stopped. They followed me wherever I went, growing more insistent, more real with Each passing hour, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison. I tried talking to my father again, but he was lost in his own world now. His eyes were vacant, his mind slipping further away from reality. He barely spoke to me. Every time I asked about the attic, he would mumble something about keeping the darkness inside. One night when I couldn't take it anymore, I grabbed flashlight and went up to the attic. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't keep living in fear, in ignorance. I took a deep breath and reached for the attic door, the old handle creaking under my fingers. With a sudden violent gust of wind, the door flung open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was nothing. Just darkness. But as I stepped forward, I felt it, the weight of eyes on me. The shadows were alive, pressing in on me from every corner of the attic. And then I saw them, faces. Twisted in agony, trapped in the darkness, their eyes. I could barely breathe. The journals my father had kept over the years lay scattered. Across the desk, their brittle pages yellowed with age. As I flipped through them, a cold shiver crawled down my spine. The words seemed to pull me deeper into a truth that wasn't ready to face, each line more disturbing than the last. The journals were filled with a history I had never known, a history of strange occurrences, shipwrecks, and disappearances that had plagued the island for centuries. The first entry I read was from my father, written in a scrawled hand that was barely legible. It spoke of the island's cursed past, how the waters surrounding it had claimed countless ships and lives, and how the island had become a place of dread, even for those who lived here. But it was the mention of a name that stopped me cold, the Whisperer, a local legend my father wrote that haunted the island at night, feeding off the fear and loneliness of those who stayed too long. I couldn't help myself. I kept reading. The further I went, the more the stories began to intertwine, painting a chilling picture of an island that wasn't just isolated in location, but cursed in spirit. There were accounts of sailors, hunters, and travelers who came to the island only to vanish without a trace. Those who survived spoke of a shadowy figure, the Whisperer, a being that moved in the darkness, speaking words that drove people mad, twisting their mind until they could no longer tell what was real. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I read on. The voices in the house, the whispers I had been hearing, were they connected to this? My father had never spoken of this entity before, never mentioned the island's dark history. It seemed that the Whisperer was a secret he had kept locked away, just like the island itself. Suddenly, the house felt colder. I looked over my shoulder, as if the shadows were closing in on me.
There it was again, the faint scraping noise from the attic. But this
time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. Someone or something was moving around up there in the dark. And then, just as I was about to stand up, I heard it, a knock at the front door. My heart skipped a beat. No one lived on the island but me and my father. We hadn't had visitors in years. I glanced toward the door, unsure whether I should go. The knocking came again, louder this time, quick, sharp, frantic. I could feel my chest tightening as I stood and made my way toward the front of the house. When I opened the door, I nearly stumbled back. Standing there, drenched to the bone, was a stranger. His clothes were soaked through, his face pale and wide-eyed with terror. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me as if he couldn't believe I was real. "You don't know what's here," he rasped, voice shaking. "You need to leave, now." I didn't have time to process his words before he rushed past me, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. I barely managed to ask him what he meant, but before I could get another word out, he was gone, vanished into the night as suddenly as he had appeared. I closed the door, my hands trembling. My mind raced with the implications of what he'd said, but something else, something darker, lingered in the air, as if whatever force haunted the island had just taken notice of me too. The walls seemed to press in, and the whispers that had once been distant now felt far too close. Was it already too late? I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear nothing else. My breath came in sharp gasps as I backed away from the door, stumbling across the room. The whispers didn't stop. They were inside my head now, echoing in my mind, calling to me like a lullaby I couldn't escape. Alex? The voice wasn't my father's, but it sounded so much like his, too familiar, too intimate. My legs shook as I sank to the floor, trying to block out the sound by pressing my hand over my ears. It didn't work. The whispers were inside me, weaving through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my sanity. They weren't just words, they were feelings. Fear, anger, despair, all wrapped up in the same endless repetition of my name. Come outside, Alex. I couldn't tell if the voice was a warning or a command. Either way, it filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The silence outside my room was suffocating, thicker than the darkness that pressed in around me. The house felt alive and watching. I forced myself to stand, using the bed for support. The whispers continued louder now, as if they were growing inside the walls, pushing through the cracks. My skin prickled with the sensation that something was wrong. Something wasn't just in my mind, it was in the house. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the handle, feeling the cold metal under my fingertips. I hesitated. A small part of me screamed to open it to see if there was something or someone waiting for me out there. Another part of me, the part that was still holding on to whatever little sanity I had left, begged me not to. But I opened it anyway. The hallway was dark, the dim light from the living room casting long shadows against the walls. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something I couldn't name. I stepped into the hall, my legs trembling with each step. The whispers followed me, moving with me, crawling into my bones. Then, I saw it, at the far end of the hall beyond the living room, a shape. It wasn't the shadow from before, but it was something worse. It was tall, too tall. Its outline shifted. Unnaturally, like the darkness around it was stretching and pulling, trying to swallow it. Hole. The whispers grew frantic. Alex, come closer. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught between terror and the overwhelming compulsion to walk toward it. The thing in the dark was waiting for me. I could feel it, a cold, heavy presence that filled the air like smoke. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I wanted to run. I needed to run. Body wouldn't obey. The whispers were still in my head, louder now, demanding. I turned back toward my room. The floor felt like it was giving way beneath me, as if the house itself was swallowing me whole, and then behind me, I heard it. Again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing in the hallway. It was closer now. Whatever was in the house, it wasn't just haunting me, it was coming. For me. I stood frozen at the threshold of the attic, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the darkness stretched out before me like a living thing. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like I was inhaling something foul. The silence was deafening, except for the steady whispering. It was no longer distant. Now, it surrounded me, an oppressive chorus of voices that seemed to come from the very walls, the faces. At first, I thought they were a trick of my eyes, shadows warped by the weak light, but as I took a hesitant step forward, the light revealed the truth, twisted, agonized faces, trapped within the dark. Their eyes were wide with fear, mouths open in silent screams. They didn't look like they were made of flesh. They were part of the darkness itself. Faces contorted in pain, their features jagged, almost unnatural, like they were being pulled from some other realm, and they were staring at me, all of them. Gazes locked onto mine, their invisible hands reaching out, pleading for release. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispering was louder now, a cacophony of my name echoing inside my skull, urgent and demanding. Alex, come closer. The whisper wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head, pulling at my thoughts. It wanted me to join them, to step into the darkness with them. I couldn't fight it. My body ached with the need to get away, but my legs felt like lead. The darkness was growing, swelling, pressing in on me. The faces seemed to stretch, their mouths twisting into grotesque smiles in their eyes. They were my eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then I saw it, just behind them, something even darker, something larger. It was there just beyond the reach of the light, watching me with a presence so suffocating, it felt like the air itself was being sucked from my lungs. I could feel it, the whisperer. It had been here all along, hiding in the corners of the house, in the shadows, waiting for me. It wasn't just a legend, it was real, and it was hungry. The faces began to move, their shadows flickering like flames, their hands stretched toward me, pulling me in with an invisible force. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My throat, my chest tightened as the walls closed in, the darkness growing heavier with each passing second. The whisperer's presence wrapped around me, squeezing until I could hardly breathe. I wasn't just seeing it, I felt it, every part of me crushed by it. Wait. In the corner of my eye, I saw the attic door slam shut. There was no escape. The walls around me pulsed with the dark energy, and I realized I had become a part of this place. I was one of them now. The faces, the whispers, they were all inside me. Myself slipping away, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. Then, just as I thought I would lose myself entirely, the voices fell silent. Everything went still. It wasn't peaceful. It was a quiet, so deep, so suffocating it felt like the calm before. Something worse. The darkness was waiting, breathing with me, watching. And then, I heard it, the whisper again. But this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The darkness had won. Share this story, but remember, every time it's told, the curse grows stronger. And who knows? Maybe something is already waiting for you in the shadows.